We were just talking at the break here on what you took out of this overall debate. We didn't get a whole lot when it came to China policy, but did we get much clarity from both of these candidates on what direction the U.S. is taking on this?
Well, we can certainly see certain tendencies, right? We see that Kamala Harris is much more keen on export control. So her talking about Trump exporting chips to China, I think that's a pretty clear sign that she is likely to continue Biden administration's policy on the high-tech export control and restrictions towards China. In comparison, what we saw from former President Trump is this emphasis on tariffs. And we know that earlier this year, he has vowed that if he is elected again, he will levy another 60% of tariff on all the imports from China. Based on what he said last night, I think he's very likely to fulfill that commitment if he is indeed elected. So we see this election as we see this election debate as the two candidates trying to tell the constituency and tell the voters what their policy platforms will be and what they are inclined to be to focus on. But for there to be a consensus on winner or a loser, I don't think there is a consensus here in the United States.
David here, Yunsun, and just to, I guess, at the risk of oversimplifying a very complex issue here, what I hear you saying is, if it's Donald Trump, the chances of a trade war are higher. If it's Kamala Harris that takes the White House, it's a chip war that we have to talk about with China. Would that be an accurate, rough representation of what the two different paths they might take?
Based on what they said last night, that's a pretty accurate description. Although I would say that for Kamala Harris, I would call it a tech war rather than a chip war because, a lot of people already see that chip was the story of yesterday. But if you listen to what she said about high-tech restriction and what the United States needs to focus on, it will be much broader than just chips.
And I mean, we've read a lot of, we talked about this, about who Beijing prefers as a candidate or as president. Some say it doesn't really matter, given it's almost like a bipartisan sort of issue when it comes to China. But does this only just force China to continue on its own foreign policy goals, which is supply chain security, solidarity in the global south, for example?
Absolutely, because when China looks at this election, I think it does have its preference. Despite the fact that the bipartisan consensus on China here in the United States, well, we know that the great power competition is here to stay as a theme of U.S. national security strategy. However, how that security is implemented, the style it is implemented, whether there is predictability or certainty or a desire for stability in the bilateral relations, that's significantly different between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. We saw that the Biden administration has pursued this strategy of extreme competition. But at the same time, we also saw Washington tried quite desperately, I would say, to reach out to China, to build a guardrail, to prevent the competition from evolving into a confrontation. And I think that means for Beijing predictability and certainty and also a desire for bottom lines. But with Donald Trump, it simply does not exist. So I think the anticipation of a high level of volatility, high level of instability is much higher under a potential Trump administration, at least in the Chinese assessment. So in that sense, I do think that Beijing has a preference, but still, both candidates are going to be tough on China. So for China, since there's very little that China can do to change or influence the result of this election, the best Beijing can do is to prepare for the worst and pursue its own course, its own national security, as well as its own foreign strategy, regardless of who is elected this November.
And I'm curious, from your very unique perspective there in the U.S., how is, okay, let's call it bulletproofing, the bulletproofing strategy China is undertaking, to your point there, of, this is a reality that's here to stay. I'm curious how China's response is being perceived in the United States. What are you seeing on the ground there?
Well, it depends on which part of the response you're talking about. During the trade war under the Trump administration, we saw that China tried its best to retaliate, right? Whenever U.S. announces additional tariffs on Chinese products, we saw that Beijing tried as much as it could to retaliate in kind or in the same proportionality, which is really hard because China runs a large trade surplus, which means that the level or the degree that China can pursue these tariffs is not going to be, it simply does not have as much space as the United States does. Then under the Biden administration, we saw that China also responded to this extreme competition strategy with China's own basically pursuit to build up its strengths in the global south, to build up its leadership, and also to compete more vigorously, for example, in the high-tech space. So I would say that regardless of who is elected, Beijing will respond to any perceived provocation or transgression comes from Washington. But in Washington's view, the fact that China's economy has slowed down and the fact that China has encountered these difficulties in terms of its export, in terms of its economic reinvigoration, I think a lot of people here see that as a victory or a success of the U.S. grand strategy or the U.S. competitive strategy against China. Whether that is true is subject to debate, and I know that even economists have a lot of different opinions. But at the minimum, I think in the United States, a lot of people see this competitive strategy as working and as effective.
And there's still a lot of uncertainty about what the American strategy is around Taiwan, for example, or just global security, the flashpoint being South China Sea right now. Yvonne, I'm just wondering, how do you see that playing out? Is the U.S. ready to go, aggressively in defending its allies here in those regions and really going against this China aggression?
I think here in Washington, the view is that the U.S. has been defending the status quo. U.S. has been defending the reality on the ground, whether it is Taiwan Strait, whether it is Taiwan, or it is Second Thomas Shoal, unrelated to Philippines' claim in the South China Sea. So that's a fundamental element in the U.S. decision-making towards China in the West Pacific. But we also know that the fundamental clash between U.S. and China, why is this centered on West Pacific, is because China sees West Pacific as China's doorstep and as a direct periphery of China's national security. But this also happens to be an area where U.S. has heavy presence in terms of its security presence and also in terms of the presence of U.S. security allies. U.S.-Japan Security Alliance is seen as a pillar of the regional security architecture in the U.S. view. So I would say that these two very different goals and aspirations coming to this region, regardless of whether it's Taiwan Strait or South China Sea, or even you go north, there's East China Sea as well as Korean Peninsula. It is a fundamental clash between two different visions about what this region should be and what the security architecture in this region should look like.
Yeah, Yunsen, it's almost the same analogy that you have with Russia and Russia's perception that NATO is, of course, coming into its doorstep. Yunsen, we could be here for a longer time. Let's do this again, please. Yunsen, there's Senior Fellow, Co-Director of the East Asia Program and Director of the China Program at the Stimson Center. Let's get to your China brief now, and we're looking at some reactions in China to the debate, of course, that took place this time yesterday between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And there's been really no commentary on state media so far, but the debate quickly becoming a very key trending topic as expected on social media platforms. Many reactions on Weibo focus on the candidates' views on China, one of which is, well, whoever wins will be tough for China. Trump might, though, be more destructive. Now, Democrats' victory will be more impactful on China in the long run, whereas, of course, Trump's impact will be only short-term. It could affect U.S. negatively, too. And
others were commenting on the debate itself, and we're pretty split when it comes to who actually won this debate. Harris is so good, one user said at this debate. She appeals to emotions and enlightens with reason. Seems that Trump was caught off guard. Another one, can you believe that Trump is close to 80? Look at how he debates and how fast he reacts. Another one saying, look, this debate was great to watch, providing so much relief after the bitter loss of China's soccer team. So, yes, that was maybe more entertaining to watch than a big loss like that.